Welcome to Surface Knowledge, the only podcast that provides you with useless information for a useful reason. Never again be stuck without an interesting tidbit or fun fact in any social situation. Here's your host, Max Curtin.
Welcome back, friends and all, to Surface Knowledge, the podcast that delivers just enough to impress in 30 minutes or less. And this week, we're going global. This episode is about espionage, paranoia, propaganda, near apocalypses, nuclear bombs, and pigeons with cameras strapped to them. That's right, you guessed it, we're going to be talking about the Cold War. Now, you know the basics, probably, hopefully, but the Cold War was that long, icy standoff between the US and the Soviet Union after World War II. This was two global superpowers locked in a decades-long game of chicken. They were pointing nuclear weapons at each other, and they kind of hoped that nobody would blink. And the Cold War itself, it wasn't just about tanks and treaties. It was more kind of a war based on ideas and ideologies. It was capitalism versus communism, East versus West, Coke versus no Coke. And while the bombs never dropped, the tension touched every single corner of the planet. Because what started as a geopolitical rivalry turned into a multi-decade pressure cooker. There were proxy wars, spy games, secret missions, and moments where we came seconds away from nuclear disaster. No joke, seconds. All without a single official battle between the two main players. And that is what makes the Cold War so fascinating. It wasn't just about conflict, it was about control. We're trying to control people, information, governments, and even up above us in outer space. So this week, in this episode, we're going to look at how it all started, how former allies became enemies after World War II. We're going to go behind the scenes into the world of espionage with real-life spies and some pretty weird covert ops. Then we're going to talk about the proxy wars that made the Cold War very real for a lot of people. And finally, we're going to explore how the conflict shaped culture, science, and daily life, and how we came this close to pressing the big red button. And then, to end it all, to wrap it all up in a nice little package, we're going to talk about whether we really left the Cold War mindset behind. So friends and neighbors, let's get ready. This is a story of tension. It's a story of secrets and the kind of power struggle that shaped the modern world. Let's gain a surface knowledge of the Cold War. All right, then, let's kick off with a bit of allies to enemies story, because the strange thing about the Cold War is that the US and the Soviet Union were on the same side at first. During World War II, they were allies, in a sense. The phrase, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," was never more applicable to these two countries. Nazi Germany was the common threat, and for a few tense years, capitalism and communism put aside their differences long enough to team up to beat Hitler. But unfortunately, that uneasy friendship didn't survive the victory. As soon as the war ended, the cracks became fault lines. Europe was in ruins, and both the US and USSR wanted to shape what came next. And we're not just talking about rebuilding here, they wanted to shape how it was with ideology. So obviously the West wanted democracy and capitalism, but the Soviets wanted communism and a buffer zone of influence in Eastern Europe. What was the result of that? The Iron Curtain. This was a term that was popularized by Winston Churchill in 1946 to describe this invisible but very real divide across Europe. On one side of the curtain, you have the NATO allies. On the other side, you have Soviet satellite states. And right slap bang in the middle of this divide is Germany, and more specifically, Berlin, which was split into East and West, despite being deep inside Soviet territory. And that setup would lead to some very tense moments later on. So in 1948, the Soviets tried to force the Allies out of Berlin by cutting off road and rail access to West Berlin. This was a tactic that was known as the Berlin Blockade. So in response, the US and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, flying in supplies non-stop for almost a year. At its peak, planes were landing in Berlin every 45 seconds. Blockade failed, but it made one thing very clear. This post-war peace was not going to last. The Cold War had officially begun and everyone knew it. So what happens then? Well, the US got busy drawing lines in the sand. We had the Truman Doctrine, which pledged to support countries resisting communism, starting with Greece and Turkey. Then there was the Marshall Plan, which offered billions in aid to rebuild Western Europe, not just for goodwill, obviously, but to prevent those countries from turning to communism in desperation. And then came NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance that said essentially, if you mess with one of us, you're going to mess with all of us. And obviously, the Soviets were not going to take that lying down. So in 1955, they responded with their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This was a bloc of Eastern European nations under Soviet influence. So now we have these two armed camps, two worldviews, and one very divided planet. And I think that's an important point to remember, that this isn't just a political conflict. It was a global battle of belief systems. The US viewed communism as repressive, expansionist, and dangerous, whereas the USSR saw capitalism as exploitative, imperialistic, and corrupt. And both sides believed that the world would be better, safer even, if everyone else agreed with them. So what you ended up with was a world split into spheres of influence, where both sides tried to win over countries, movements, and minds, not with war, but through pressure, persuasion, and proxy fights. And as we know, the Cold War wasn't just this single event. It was this kind of shape-shifting landscape of tension. Some moments were boiling hot, others were eerily calm, but it never went away. So this helped shape global diplomacy, military spending, technology, and foreign policy for nearly 50 years. This also created an environment of constant suspicion. No one trusted anyone, not their allies, not their enemies, and definitely not their own citizens. And that suspicion would fuel a very kind of different battlefield that had never been seen before. This is one filled with spies, secret missions, sabotage, and paranoia. So if the Cold War was a game, let's say, then you can almost treat espionage as the board. The pieces were people, secrets, and so many lies. Both the US and Soviet Union had vast, sprawling intelligence networks. On the US side, you had the CIA. On the USSR side, you had the KGB. And in the middle of those two, you have a planet full of people being watched, wiretapped, followed, recruited, or blackmailed, sometimes not even knowing it. So it's not a shooting war anymore. Now it's a war of information, and nothing was off the table. Because the Cold War era saw some of the most dramatic spy operations in modern history. Entire novels could be written, and there are many that have been, about double agents, secret drop points, and midnight rendezvous in East Berlin alleys. So I just want to go through a couple of the most famous spy stories before we move on here. There was Aldrich Ames, who was a high-ranking CIA agent who secretly spied for the Soviets for nearly a decade. He sold out assets and fed information that led to the death of several American informants. Robert Hanssen, another mole, this time in the FBI, who passed classified info to the Soviets and later the Russians over 20 years. The Cambridge Five were a ring of British spies, all educated at Cambridge, who passed secrets to USSR. And the fun bit about them is that they were all highly placed in British intelligence and foreign services. And then we have Oleg Gordievsky, who was a high-ranking KGB officer who secretly worked for British intelligence and provided critical insight into Soviet thinking during the 1980s. There wasn't just the big names in high-ranking positions. There were hundreds of agents deployed all around the world, often under deep cover, posing as diplomats, journalists, or even just business people. Some operated for decades before they were discovered, even if they were discovered at all. Now, when we talk about weird tactics that were used, the tech of the Cold War was straight out of a Bond movie, because in a lot of cases, the tech that existed in real life inspired those Bond movies. You had stuff like lipstick pistols, umbrellas that fired ricin pellets, and this was used in the assassination of Bulgarian dissident Georgy Markov. You had microfilm that was hidden in hollow coins, shaving cream canisters, and shoe heels. There were dead drops hidden in park benches, walls, or trees. And even there were cats trained as audio surveillance devices. This was called Operation Acoustic Kitty, which, to no one's shock, was an absolute disaster. And they weren't the only animals that got in on the act. There were also spy pigeons that were fitted with tiny cameras, and they were released over sensitive sites. The US used dolphins to detect mines and potentially spy on Soviet submarines, and at one point the CIA even explored using psychics under a program called Project Stargate. No tactic was too strange if it had the chance of working. And on the flip side of the coin, information was just as powerful as espionage, and both sides waged propaganda campaigns to win the hearts and minds and headlines of its listeners. So the US operated Radio Free Europe and Voice of America, broadcasting pro-democracy messages behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets responded with jamming signals, fake news, and their own state-run media, pumping out anti-American content. Both sides created films, posters, cartoons, educational materials, and news stories designed to make the other side look evil, incompetent, or corrupt. You even had Hollywood getting involved at some points, with the Cold War anxieties creeping into movies. Things like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Red Dawn. And this wasn't just for outside audiences. Domestically, governments used fear to shape public opinion. From McCarthyism in the US to constant surveillance under the Stasi in East Germany. This meant that the Cold War wasn't just fought with spies and radios, it was fought inside people's minds. The US and USSR explored psychological operations, or PSYOPs. The CIA ran MK Ultra. This was an infamous and highly unethical program that experimented with mind control using LSD, hypnosis, and sensory deprivation on unwilling participants. Meanwhile, the Soviets explored psychotronics, supposed mind-influence technologies, and used psychiatric institutions to silence dissidents, labeling political opponents as mentally ill. Most of this kind of bordered on science fiction, and some of it became science fact. All of it added to the sense that the enemy could be anyone, anywhere, and maybe they could get inside your head. Then we also had the numbers stations. These were shortwave radio broadcasts that still play today. These are just a series of beeps, tones, or numbers read aloud by an automated voice. No one has officially admitted who runs them, but they've long been suspected to carry coded messages to spies in the field. So imagine being a Soviet agent living in a quiet American suburb. You turn on your scratchy radio at a set hour to hear a robot voice saying things like 72900, repeat 72, and that's how they would relay messages in the field. So Cold War espionage at this point, it's not shadowy, it's surreal, it's bizarre to think that this stuff was actually happening. And the spy game defined the Cold War's atmosphere. We had tense, secretive, and full of invisible lines. But sometimes this Cold War, wasn't so cold. Sometimes it got very hot, just not in the places where you might expect. So, while the US and the Soviet Union never fired on each other directly, what they did is they fought each other through other people's wars, funding, training, and arming opposing sides in conflicts all over the world. They're not side skirmishes, they were deadly, they were destructive, and in some cases, they're still affecting global politics today. So first of all, we had the Korean War, which went from 1950 to 1953. So just 5 years after World War II had ended, the Cold War heated up on the Korean Peninsula. So North Korea, backed by the Soviets and later China, invaded South Korea, which was supported by the United States and its allies. Now, this wasn't obviously a covert operation, this was a full-scale war. Over 3 million people died. The fighting ended in a stalemate and an armistice, not a peace treaty, meaning technically that the war still isn't over today, and that border between North and South Korea remains one of the most militarized places on Earth. Then we have the Vietnam War, which went from 1955 to 1975, and is possibly the most infamous proxy war of the Cold War era. Now, the Vietnam War was a very messy, brutal conflict that began as an anti-colonial rebellion, but became a Cold War flashpoint. North Vietnam, which was supported by the USSR and China, fought to unify the country under communism, whereas South Vietnam, backed by the US, resisted. So America's involvement escalated with over 500,000 troops deployed at the peak. The war dragged on, it sparked domestic protests, and it ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975. This was a devastating loss for the US and a major psychological blow in the Cold War. Next, you had the Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989. So the Soviets had their own Vietnam kind of in Afghanistan. In 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan to support its communist government against Islamist insurgents. The US and other Western nations saw an opportunity here, and they began supplying the Mujahideen fighters with weapons, including shoulder-fired missiles that could take down Soviet helicopters. And fun sad fact, do you want to know who one of those fighters were? It was a young Osama bin Laden. Now, the war bled the Soviet Union dry, both financially and politically, and it's often cited as one of the final nails in the coffin for the USSR itself. Now, bringing it back closer to the early hot point of the Cold War, there was obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened in 1962. Now, if there was a moment where the Cold War almost ended the world itself, this is that moment. In 1962, US spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and the US obviously demanded their removal. The Soviets said no, and for 13 days in 1962, the world held its breath as these two superpowers moved closer and closer to nuclear war. President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade. Soviet ships then approached. One wrong move and it was all over. Eventually, luckily, both sides blinked. The USSR removed the missiles. The US quietly removed its missiles from Turkey, and we could all breathe again. But this is still considered the most dangerous moment in modern history, when nuclear war felt genuinely imminent. And if we fast forward to the 1980s, tensions are still high 18 years later, especially under Reagan, who called the Soviet Union the evil empire. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system detected what looked like a US missile launch. Then another, then more. So according to protocol, the minute that signal came in, the USSR should have retaliated. But one single man, Stanislav Petrov, a duty officer monitoring the system, chose not to report it as an attack because he had a gut feeling that the system was malfunctioning. And he was right. It was a false alarm caused by reflections from clouds. His decision to hold off on notifying anyone may have stopped World War III. This guy received no medals, he wasn't celebrated, but he might be one of the most important people in modern history as the man who saved the world. And for fun, we also have Able Archer 83. That same year, NATO ran a military exercise called Able Archer 83, which was the idea of simulating a nuclear war scenario. Problem is, they did it so realistically that the Soviets thought it was a cover for an actual first strike. So they raised their alert level. Nuclear-capable bombers were armed and ready, and again, it came down to restraint. Both sides backed off before things got out of control. All of this kind of sounds like we're talking about movie plots, but they're real moments where the Cold War nearly became a hot one, with the highest possible stakes. All of this tension that we're talking about operated under one terrifying logic, and that logic was called, as an acronym, MAD, which is very fitting. Mutually Assured Destruction. The idea is very simple. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate so completely that both civilizations would be wiped out. No one wins, everybody dies. It was horrific. But in a weird way, it worked, because the sheer scale of destruction became a almost deterrent. The Cold War was like two people in a room full of gasoline, and they're both having lighters in their hands, daring each other to flick the wick first. I want to move past the bombs and the bullets here, and I want to talk about how this massive global standoff changed culture, science, and everyday life. Even if you weren't living near a front line, the Cold War was impossible to ignore. It crept into classrooms, news broadcasts, movie theaters, kitchen cupboards, and even children's games. It wasn't just a political standoff anymore, it was a constant, low-grade hum of fear and preparation that touched almost every aspect of life. One of the most defining features of Cold War culture was the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. Fun. And that might sound dramatic, but I intended it to be, but it was also very real. In the US, kids practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks in case of a nuclear blast, as if a sheet of plywood and chewing gum would protect them from a mushroom cloud, but whatever. Fallout shelters were advertised in magazines. Several defense films showed families how to pack canned food and bottle water for weeks underground. In the USSR, drills were just as common. Soviet citizens were taught how to evacuate, hide from radiation, and keep calm if the world did come to an end. And the message was always clear: this could happen today, and we'd better be prepared for it. But fear wasn't the only motivator. The Cold War also pushed some of the most astonishing scientific achievements in human history. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, which was the first man-made satellite, it shocked the world and ignited the space race. Suddenly, outer space wasn't just about science, it was about ideological dominance. The USSR followed with Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. The US responded by investing billions into NASA, and in 1969 they landed Apollo 11 on the moon, planted that flag, and declared in no uncertain terms who had won that particular round. Behind the scenes of all of that, space tech and missile tech were often one and the same. Rockets that could send a man to the moon could also deliver a warhead across the ocean. And then we had art and entertainment becoming another battleground. This was one of ideas, emotion, and influence. In the US, Cold War anxieties played out on screen in movies like Dr. Strangelove. This was a black comedy about nuclear war. Fantastic film, please watch it if you haven't. Then there was The Day After. This was a terrifyingly realistic portrayal of nuclear attacks on American soil. Then we have Rocky IV. This is literally the USA and the USSR punching each other in the face until someone wins. And then we have James Bond, with all of its Cold War villains and gadgets galore. Meanwhile, on the other side, Soviet cinema told stories of brave workers, loyal citizens, and the threat of capitalist corruption. It wasn't just propaganda, it was national identity. They crafted it through film. And even children's media wasn't immune. You had cartoons, comics, and toys that often had underlying Cold War themes. Good guys and bad guys, East and West, spies and heroes. Cold War was also fought on tracks, in pools, and across chessboards. The Olympics became proxy battles for ideological supremacy. Medal counts were treated like scoreboard tallies in the War of Systems. In 1972, American chess grandmaster Bobby Fischer defeated Soviet legend Boris Spassky in a match billed as the match of the century. And as you kind of guessed from what we've been talking about, it was treated as a Cold War showdown. In 1980, the US boycotted the Moscow Olympics. In 1984, the Soviets boycotted the LA Olympics. Sports had suddenly become politics with a starting pistol. And even music saw divides. Soviet youth smuggled in rock records and Western pop. Anything that crossed the border symbolized freedom or subversion, depending on which side you were on. And Cold War culture wasn't all external threats. Most of it turned inwards into the actual country itself. In the US, McCarthyism gripped the country in the early 1950s. This was Senator Joseph McCarthy, who led a crusade to expose alleged communists in government, Hollywood, and everyday life. Careers were destroyed. Paranoia spread like wildfire. People were blacklisted for as little as having a leftist book on their shelf. Across the Iron Curtain, things were even more intense. The Stasi, which is East Germany's secret police, maintained one of the most oppressive surveillance states in history. They had files on 1 in every 3 citizens. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Family members spied on each other. Fear wasn't just external, it was now embedded in daily life. So we go from sports and cinema to bunkers and brainwashing. The Cold War wasn't just a standoff between governments. It was a cultural operating system that ran in the background of everyday life for nearly half a century. So as we wind down this episode, what was the final act in the Cold War? How did it stop? Or did it ever stop? So the Cold War didn't end with a bang. It ended with a wall coming down, an empire quietly dissolving, and a stunned world watching it happen faster than almost anyone expected. After decades of brinkmanship, propaganda, and arms races, the Cold War collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. By the late 70s and early 80s, both sides were exhausted. politically, financially, and culturally. That led to periods of reduced tension known as détente, where arms limitation treaties were signed, leaders visited each other's capitals, and there was cautious optimism that things might just cool off, but progress was slow and trust remained very thin. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union's final leader and a man with radically different ideas. His policies on openness and restructuring aimed to reform the USSR from within, economically, politically, and socially, which ironically, those reforms exposed just how broken the system was. In 1989, Eastern Bloc countries began to push back. Hungary opened its borders, protests erupted in East Germany, and then, almost overnight, the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Cold War, came tumbling down. No invasion, no missiles, just people with sledgehammers and a tide of change that couldn't be stopped. And within 2 years, the Soviet Union collapsed. On December 26, 1991, it ceased to exist. 15 independent republics emerged and the Cold War was officially over. Now, most analysts thought the Cold War would last well into the 21st century, maybe even indefinitely. But the Soviet economy was crumbling, oil prices had fallen, and decades of military spending had hollowed out domestic infrastructure. And the US wasn't immune either. They had spent heavily too, but they had a stronger economy and more stable political system. In the end, the Cold War wasn't just won on ideology, it was lost on logistics. And it wasn't military power that ended it, it was internal pressure, it was mismanagement, and it was a quiet revolution from within. Now, even though the Cold War ended in the early 90s, almost 30.5 years ago, its fingerprints are still everywhere. NATO is still active and expanding. Russia's relationship with the West is still tense at best to describe it. And the nuclear arsenals I was talking about, well, they're still here. There's thousands of warheads that remain, and global arms reductions are still a work in progress. We have surveillance culture, proxy conflicts, and information warfare. They didn't vanish, they just evolved and changed. And the Cold War gave rise to powerful technologies, including early computer networks, satellite systems, and space exploration. That laid the groundwork for the world that we live in today. The Cold War taught us that the most dangerous weapon isn't always a bomb. It's more likely going to be fear. Fear of the other side, fear of being behind, fear of losing control. It also showed that deterrence can work, but only just. We got incredibly close to the brink more than once, and each time, survival came down to a decision made by a single person in a single moment under unthinkable pressure. And I don't think that's a blueprint for peace. That's more like a warning label. Cold War ended without fire, but with fragile relief. The kind where people looked around and wondered, how did we make it out alive? And if you ever find yourself thinking, this could never happen again, just remember, all it takes is tension, ego, and uncertainty, and suddenly you're back in that room full of gasoline, holding a lighter with your thumb on the spark wheel. And that's been your surface knowledge of the Cold War, a conflict that never exploded, but still managed to shape half a century of politics, science, fear, and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate the show, leave a review, and share it with someone who still thinks that duck and cover drills are a good idea. You can follow us across socials at Surface Knowledge Pod for bonus clips and daily facts. And if you've got ideas, stories, or your granddad used to actually work on a number station, and I definitely want to hear about that one, email godtail5@gmail.com. I look forward to welcoming you back next week, where we're going to be gaining a surface knowledge of the deep ocean.
You've been listening to the Surface Knowledge Podcast, part of the GT5 network. Be sure to subscribe and rate on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. We'll see you back here soon for another episode. Until next time, stay curious.